I come down here every March, down here to Chivelstone Church, to lay flowers on this grave. 9 men of the sea are buried here, strangers, drowned during the great blizzard of 1891. Most of the men are from Sweden. Rasmussen, Nielsen. And with their families and loved ones so far away, well, it falls to us locals to honour their dead. It's the fisherman's way, to take care of the people, living and dead, who are washed up on our shores. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Mrs. Perry, the Coast Guard's wife. I live down over there in the Coast Guard's cottage with Mr. Perry. We look out for each other along this stretch of coastline, all the way from Slapton to Prawle Point and beyond. Because this coastline, well, it's dangerous, as it is beautiful. Looks lovely, doesn't it? Spring is here. Snowdrops are nodding their pretty white heads. Yellow daffodils brightening up the roadside verges. But living on the coast as we do, we know that just because signs of spring are showing themselves doesn't mean that winter has packed his bags and gone away. Being by the sea, we know to guard ourselves against the hope that spring tries so hard to bring. Who could have predicted the treacherous storm that hit these shores on the 9th of March, 1891? 3 days of freezing cold wind, gales, blinding snowfall, even thunder and lightning to top it off. My friend the postmistress from Marlborough, she told me that the Kingsbridge Road was blocked with snow in a matter of hours, that a coach and horses south of Lodgeswell got stuck in a snowdrift as high as a man. The Western Morning News, the Great Western Trains, the Totnes Post, all came to a standstill. Not even the important telegrams could get through. No one in their right mind would have been out on a night like that. And those poor sailors already at sea found themselves at the mercy of one of the most powerful storms in living memory. Between Hall Sands and Prawle Point, there were 4 shipwrecks that night. Over 50 men lost their lives. And that is the most people that have lost their lives in one night along this stretch of coastline. I'm going to tell you the story of the Marana. That's the ship that these men were in. These men could not have foreseen their fate when they left London at 11 o'clock that morning, bound for Colombo with a cargo of railway sleepers. And that's the story that I will tell you. And I'd like your help as well, because there are some things that we know, but there are many things that we may never know. It came out of nowhere, the snow, falling thick and fast on the Monday afternoon. I'd just taken the washing out and put it on the line when I saw the sky turning black. Typical, I thought, for putting my washing out. And by the time I brought the laundry in and folded it up, all I could see out the window was a white sheet of snow. And it was freezing too. It was no Christmas scene, I tell you. And I was glad that I'd asked the children to bring the wood in, for it was bitterly cold. It was my friend Mrs. Briggs, the lighthouse keeper's wife, who told me what had happened. She could see it all from her living room window. It was about 5:30 in the afternoon when she first saw the Marana getting into trouble. It was sailing off course and coming in close to the rocks. Mind you, how anybody could steer straight in that almighty gale, I do not know. She's got a better view from her dining room, so she rushed in there, and through the rain-streaked windows she could see the steamship, broadside against the Blackstone rocks, the sea battering at its iron belly. Well, she grabbed her shawl and her hat, and she ran down to the lighthouse to go and alert Mr. Jones, the head lighthouse keeper. The snow was blinding white now, and she felt lost, even though she had walked that path 1,000 times. When Mr. Jones heard the news, well, he sent out a signal to all the coast guards and fishermen and lighthouse keepers along the coast. That's where my Mr. Perry comes in. But Mr. Jones' first thought was for the sailors. And from the lighthouse he could look down onto the rocks, and he could see the Marana beginning to break up. The tide was tearing it in two. The wind was whirling in a frenzy, and the snow was falling furiously. And his first thought was for the sailors. He imagined them all drowned in a moment, swallowed by the sea. And as the wind fought with the snow and the sea gods battled against the storm giants, there were two forces at play that night. Humans trying to save lives, and the wild seas trying to devour souls. It all happened so quick, Mrs. Briggs said. She could see that they were letting down the small boats, the lifeboats, from the side of the ship. It was heartbreaking, she said, to see them getting let down with no people inside of them. But there were people inside of them. It's just that Mrs. Briggs couldn't see them. "Land right ahead!" The shout went out about the boat. The engines of the Marana going full steam ahead. The freezing winds were howling through the metalwork, huge waves crashing over the side. Most of the seamen were below, but many were above deck, and the captain stood on the bridge. It was then just a matter of moments before the Marana hit the Blackstone rocks. Propeller, rudder immediately struck off, sinking to the seabed like a boulder. And the lighthouse, it stood like a stone angel atop of the cliffs, its lamps lit despite the daylight. And what was happening in the hearts and minds of those 28 men we may never know. But each soul knew that it would take a miracle to survive. The Marana had 4 lifeboats on its side, 2 small ones and 2 bigger lifeboats. And over the roar of the sea, the captain could be heard, "Let down the lifeboats, starboard first." It's a captain's duty to do right by his men. And so it was that the captain gave his own lifebelt to Seaman Anders Jonsson. So with no choice but to help each other, 22 men, each one wearing a lifebelt, and inside that lifeboat they pushed away from the wounded ship. The freezing temperatures made their hands and feet numb. They could barely handle the boat. One man had no shoes on. And the snow was so intense they could hardly see in front of their noses. 22 men of the world, travellers themselves who'd visited far-flung countries, places where they would buy blue gemmed jewellery for their loved ones, buy gold snake rings for themselves. Each one with families and fiancés back home, eager to see that handwritten letter drop through the letterbox. Or the captain's voice. He gave one last word of advice to the seamen. "Keep to the shore! Keep to the shore, lads. I'm afraid you will all be drowned." Back on board the fast-sinking Marana were left the captain, the 3 mates, the chief officer and the mess-room steward. With the salt spray lashing against their shivering bodies, they climbed into the small boat on the leeward side, the side where the devilish seas were smashing against the ship and the rocks. And they all climbed into that small boat, and into the darkness they sailed away, in grave danger in those swelling seas. But over on the other side, on the starboard side, the 22 men were heading for Prawl Point. And against the blizzard that they could hardly see, they sailed on, past Lanarcombe Cove, on to Horsley Cove. But the surf was so strong, so tumultuous, that although they tried to land, they could not reach the shore. And they had come so far, got away from the wreck, sailed through the blizzards, to be so close to the land, only unable to reach it. I know this because Mr. Perry told me. He met Anders Jonsson later that night, about 11 o'clock, because Anders Jonsson had made his way to a cottage at Prawl and knocked on the door. Mr. Perry had gone down there with brandy and blankets, and they tried to understand what Anders was saying, but because he was Swedish, they couldn't. And so they didn't know where the men were or where they had to go and look for them. The coast guards, the fishermen, the lighthouse keepers, they were all working in relay up and down this coast that night, trying to find out where the men were, trying to rescue them and bring them to safety. Blue flares were set up into the sky, and the life-saving apparatus was ready for use. Mrs. Briggs and I, we were back home, keeping the home fires burning, making soup, and gathering all the warm things we could find. There were 28 crew on the Marana, all men of the world from Sweden, one Russian Finn, British mostly from London. What Mr. Perry and I know is that 3 of them survived, including Anders Jonsson, that 9 of them are buried here in Chivelstone graveyard. And before I go, let me tell you about that. Everyone involved in the rescue, the fishermen, the coast guards and the lighthouse keepers and all the villagers, they came to the funeral of those 9 poor souls, and they gave them a good send-off. It's the fisherman's way. When people arrive on our shores, be they living or dead, we take care of them and do our best by them, as we would hope that people in far distant lands would do for our loved ones too. And that is as much as I know. So that's the end of my tale, and it is all true. Now what happened next, that is over to you. So that was my story, and it was all true. And I'd like you to help tell what happened next. That's why I said it's over to you. So I've told a story based on the Great Blizzard of 1891. There were 4 shipwrecks along this coast, and I've told you about one of them and the 28 crew of the Marana. But I took it to the point where we don't know what happens next. What happens next is what I'd like you to help with, to write a story, a really imaginative story. We're not asking you to tell the truth or find out what's historically right. You can be imaginative. You can say anything you like. And here is the point we're taking the story from. From when the 22 men were in the lifeboat that was going towards Prawl Point, and they were nearly at the shore. What happened there? There was the captain and his crew in the smaller boat going out onto the leeward side into the darkness. What happened to them? Anders Jonsson, we know, came to a cottage in Prawl and survived. But what happened? And how did he get from the boat to the cottage? Your story could last a few years. Your story could last for a few hours. You could be inspired by folklore. Did they get rescued by mermaids? Folk tales are full of mermaids and merfolk rescuing sailors, or even underground worlds like Lyonesse. We know that the railway sleepers from the Marana were found as far away as Eastern Europe. Where did our sailors get to? Use your imaginations, have fun with it as I've had fun telling you this true story, and I really look forward to reading and hearing your stories that you make up. Goodbye.